In the humid dawn of early March 1943, amidst the grit of Port Moresby, Papua, New Guinea, a steel wrench clattered to the ground, slipping from the oil-slicked fingers of Captain Paul Irvin Gunn as he gazed, utterly transfixed, at the beast of a bomber before him. Cradled within that aircraft's frame was a secret that flouted all logic, an entity that brazenly defied every single regulation etched into the United States Army Air Force's manuals, a clandestine project his own commanding officer had never dared to officially approve. A fearsome array of 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns jutted out from the space where a bombardier's delicate glass nose was supposed to be. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber conceived for the delicate art of precision bombing from the safety of the clouds, had been grotesquely reborn into something else entirely. It was now a hunter of ships, a destroyer of commerce, an unsanctioned experiment that would either become the salvation of the Pacific theater or the very instrument that would see Gunn facing a court-martial. What neither Gunn nor any other soul could possibly fathom was that this forbidden modification, a desperate creation born from a crucible of personal fury, was about to unleash the single most devastating defeat the Japanese Navy would ever endure throughout the entire Pacific campaign. The complex arithmetic of Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific was not being calculated in the sterile war rooms of Washington, but was instead being forged in the fiery glow of welding shops and the greasy reality of maintenance hangars by a 43-year-old maverick consumed by his own private war. The long and arduous path to this pivotal moment had truly commenced 2 years prior, on the fateful day of December 8, 1941, Manila time. Paul Irvin Gunn, not yet the legend known as Pappy to anyone, stood helplessly on Nichols Field, his eyes witnessing the methodical, relentless destruction of American air power in the Philippines by wave after wave of Japanese bombers. As the manager of the nascent Philippine Airlines, he was the custodian of 4 Red Beach 18 civilian aircraft. In a matter of mere hours, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer those very planes and bestow upon Gunn the rank of captain in the Army Air Corps, initiating what was supposed to be a brief tour of wartime duty, but would spiral into a 3-year odyssey of relentless innovation, burning revenge, and a technological revolution. At 42 years old, Gunn was a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer, a man who had dedicated 20 years of his life as an enlisted naval aviator before his retirement in December 1939. He had mastered the art of flight in the roaring 1920s, had soared with the legendary Top Hatters fighter squadron, and had shaped new pilots as an instructor at Pensacola Naval Air Station. His knowledge of aircraft was not born from textbooks, but was etched into his very being through 2 decades of building them, flying them, and sometimes even crashing them. Yet on that grim December morning, all his technical prowess counted for nothing. Gunn was confronted with a far more visceral and immediate crisis. His wife, Clara Louise, known affectionately as Polly to all, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila as the relentless tide of Japanese forces closed in. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were on the cusp of manhood as teenagers. His daughters, Connie and Julie, were still young. The family had carved out a comfortable expatriate life in Manila, while Gunn managed the airline, an existence that had simply vanished in the blink of an eye. During the chaotic weeks that spiraled into chaos, Gunn flew ceaseless reconnaissance and transport missions across the crumbling Philippine defenses. He danced with death, evading Japanese fighters, even surviving a crash into the dense jungle, only to walk out to safety and immediately climb into the cockpit of another plane. On one such mission, he secured a distinguished flying cross by piloting an unarmed transport straight into the heart of Bataan, delivering vital medical supplies to the besieged American forces, his only guides being pure skill and raw audacity as he navigated through airspace swarming with Japanese planes. Still, he could not get to his family. On Christmas Eve of 1941, Gunn was handed orders to evacuate critical personnel to the safety of Australia. He hastily gathered all his military pay, borrowed every dollar he could from his fellow officers, and made desperate preparations to spirit his family away to safety. But the Japanese advance was a mercilessly swift torrent. His family simply couldn't reach the airfield in the sliver of time they had. Gunn was faced with an impossible choice: abandon his loved ones or defy a direct order. He flew to Australia because an order was an order, because the vast machinery of war was bigger than any single family, because to stay meant certain death or capture. Within a few short weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were swept up by Japanese forces and herded to the University of Santo Tomas, a place of learning twisted into an internment camp for enemy civilians. Learning this news shattered something deep within Gunn. The man who continued the fight was a different man from the one who had departed Manila. He had left his wife and 4 children to the mercy of an enemy infamous for its brutality. Every single day they languished in that camp was a day Gunn was powerless to protect them. The only path left to him was to accelerate the war's end. If he was barred from saving his family directly, then he would obliterate every ship, every plane, every single supply line that sustained the Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was never official policy. This was pure vengeance, cleverly cloaked in the guise of innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney swept into Brisbane in the latter part of July 1942 to seize command of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific area, he inherited a catastrophe. His predecessor had been unceremoniously relieved of duty. Morale was a ghost lingering in the depths of despair. The equipment was tragically insufficient. The Japanese held dominion over the skies of New Guinea and posed a direct threat to Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Theater Commander, possessed zero confidence in his air forces and made his disdain painfully and abundantly clear. Kenney, at 53, was a seasoned World War I fighter ace, with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star to his name. He had sharpened minds at the Air Corps Tactical School and was celebrated for his brilliantly unconventional thinking. When MacArthur subjected him to a full hour-long tirade detailing the failings of Allied air power, Kenney listened with unwavering politeness and then made a simple request: the authority to send home anyone he deemed to be deadwood. MacArthur, taken aback by the sheer audacity of the request, consented. Within weeks, Kenney had radically restructured his command, injecting it with aggressive, younger officers and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea to be closer to the fight. To quicken the pace of decision-making, he appointed Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander, granting him the power to reassign aircraft based on the shifting realities of weather and tactics, rather than waiting for bureaucratic approval from Brisbane. But shifting personnel was meaningless without weapons that could actually strike a blow. Allied bombing from medium and high altitudes was proving to be a catastrophic failure against the agile Japanese ships. Bombing from great heights simply gave the ships ample time to evade. The mighty B-17 flying fortresses were striking less than 1% of their targets. Consequently, Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with arrogant impunity. Allied soldiers were dying in the suffocating jungle, while fresh Japanese troops streamed ashore from vessels that the bombers were utterly incapable of sinking. Kenney had been wrestling with this very problem since 1928, back when he was an instructor at the tactical school. He had developed a theory about skip bombing, a daring technique of releasing bombs at an extremely low altitude, causing them to ricochet across the water's surface like a flat stone on a pond, before slamming into the vulnerable sides of ships below the waterline, where their armor was thinnest. The concept itself was brilliant. The execution, however, was proving to be dangerously difficult. The B-17s were critically lacking in forward-firing armament. Roaring in at mast height meant flying directly into a storm of withering anti-aircraft fire with no way to suppress the enemy gunners. And then, Kenney discovered Paul Gunn, and in that moment, the entire equation of the war changed. In August of 1942, word reached Kenney that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was performing unauthorized modifications on A-20 Havoc light bombers. These modifications were raw, almost crude, but undeniably effective. Someone had ripped out the bombardier from the transparent nose, and in his place installed 4 50-caliber machine guns, all locked to fire forward. The strategy was to strafe Japanese positions at terrifyingly low altitudes, silencing ground fire just before dropping their bombs. Kenny's investigation led him to Captain Paul Gunn, a man working almost entirely alone, scavenging weapons from the skeletal remains of wrecked fighters and grafting them onto attack aircraft. Gunn had taught himself the intricate art of aircraft modification through a relentless process of trial and error. He held no formal engineering degree, yet he possessed an innate understanding of aircraft structures, of weight distribution, and of weapons systems, a knowledge born from 2 decades of intimate, hands-on experience. Most officers would have promptly court-martialed Gunn for daring to alter military aircraft without a shred of authorization. Kenny, however, immediately assigned him to his personal staff as a special projects officer and handed him a mission that bordered on the impossible: modify every single A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack. And do it now. Gunn plunged into a relentless cycle of 18-hour days. He scavenged weapons from crashed planes, fabricated mounting brackets in hastily assembled workshops, and personally took each modified aircraft into the sky for its test flight. He armed the nose of each A-20 with 450 caliber machine guns, mounted even more guns along the fuselage, and fitted bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. The transformed A-20s roared into combat in September 1942, their target a Japanese airfield at Buna. The outcome surpassed every single expectation. The Strafer A-20s screamed in at treetop level, their guns erupting in a blaze of fury, suppressing anti-aircraft positions moments before releasing their deadly cargo. Japanese defenders, who were accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could spot for minutes on end, were given no time to react. The attack obliterated dozens of aircraft on the ground and served as a powerful demonstration that low-level strafing could utterly revolutionize aerial warfare. Without a moment's hesitation, Kenny ordered Gunn to commence work on a similar modification, this time for the B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was a larger beast than the A-20. It possessed a greater range, carried a heavier bomb load, and could be armed with a more formidable array of forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could successfully transform the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the single most potent anti-shipping weapon in the entire theater. The B-25 Mitchell had been conceived in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engine aircraft, its wings stretching 67 feet and 7 inches, propelled by 2 Wright R-2600 radial engines that each churned out 1,900 horsepower. Its standard armament comprised 6 50 caliber machine guns for defense and a 3,000-pound bomb load. It was operated by a crew of 5: a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The aircraft bore the name of General Billy Mitchell, the controversial champion of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his fiercely outspoken beliefs. An astonishing total of approximately 9,890 B-25s would ultimately roll off the production lines at 2 North American aviation plants, one located in Inglewood, California, and the other in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 had rocketed to fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a squadron of 16 B-25Bs on a breathtakingly audacious raid against Tokyo, launching them from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. While the raid inflicted minimal physical damage, it delivered a colossal morale boost to an American public still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. More critically, it compelled Japan to retain fighter aircraft for the defense of its homeland rather than deploying them to the front lines. Yet the B-25's principal function remained medium-altitude bombing, a mission at which it was proving distressingly ineffective against naval targets. Gunn, however, looked at the B-25 and perceived a potential that no one else had recognized. The aircraft's nose section was spacious enough to house multiple heavy machine guns. Its twin-engine design offered crucial redundancy. The loss of one engine would not spell doom for the aircraft. Its robust construction could withstand significant punishment. And most importantly, the Mitchell possessed the range necessary to reach the vital Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 simply could not. In late 1942, Gunn commenced the transformation of B-25s within a maintenance hangar in Townsville, Australia. He was collaborating with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in the theater. Fox's official duty was to ensure that any aircraft modifications strictly adhered to factory specifications. Instead, he became Gunn's willing co-conspirator in what would evolve into the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of the entire war. The initial hurdle was the removal of the bombardier and his entire glass nose section. This action saved precious weight and eliminated a vulnerable position that was utterly useless for low-altitude attack profiles. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal housing that bristled with 450 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all aimed forward and controlled directly by the pilot. Each gun was fed by 500 rounds of ammunition. The rate of fire was a staggering 850 rounds per minute per gun, which meant the pilot could unleash a veritable hurricane of lead that would shred any target to ribbons in mere seconds. But for Gunn, 4 guns were simply not enough. He added 2 more 50 caliber guns in cheek blisters, one on each side of the forward fuselage, positioned just below and behind the cockpit. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, enabling them to fire without their bullets passing through the spinning propeller disc. They were fixed, firing forward, adding even more firepower to the pilot's arsenal. Then Gunn made a truly radical decision. The B-25 was equipped with a dorsal turret, armed with twin 50 caliber guns, mounted behind the cockpit. This turret was designed to rotate, defending against attacks from above and behind. Gunn locked the turret into a fixed forward-firing position, adding 2 more guns to the pilot's formidable control. The co-pilot could now operate these guns using a sight in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously with a single master trigger. Now, the modified B-25 boasted 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, capable of delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second. To put this in perspective, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50 caliber guns. The modified B-25 now possessed the forward firepower of more than 1 fighter aircraft, concentrated in a platform that also carried 2,000 pounds of bombs. These modifications, however, introduced significant engineering challenges. The addition of weight to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, making it dangerously nose-heavy and difficult to handle. Gunn compensated by meticulously repositioning equipment further aft and adding ballast to the tail section. The immense recoil from 8 guns firing in unison created tremendous structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing to withstand the shock. The guns generated intense heat and thick smoke. Gunn installed ventilation systems and relocated ammunition storage to mitigate the risk of fire. Most critically, Gunn had to master the complex problem of gun harmonization. The 8 guns needed to converge their fire at a precise point in front of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns were not perfectly aligned, their bullets would spray in every direction except at the target. Gunn devised a ground testing procedure using targets placed at measured distances, painstakingly adjusting each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged with absolute precision. He test-fired the guns himself, making minute adjustments, refusing to approve any aircraft until it met his exacting standards. The entire modification process consumed approximately 2 weeks per aircraft, with crews working around the clock. Gunn trained maintenance teams to perform the work, establishing efficient production line techniques. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to fully equip the 90th Bombardment Squadron. The squadron required a commander who truly understood low-altitude attack and was unafraid to defy conventional bombing doctrine. Kenny chose Major Ed Larner, a pilot who had skyrocketed from first lieutenant to major in just a few weeks, thanks to his aggressive leadership in combat. Larner had shown exceptional skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenny's complete trust. Together, Larner and Gunn developed the tactics that would forever change the face of naval warfare. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese ships at an incredibly low altitude, sometimes a mere 50 feet above the water, flying at their maximum speed of approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they were nearly impossible for ship gunners to track. The closing speed was far too rapid for manual aiming, and the aircraft were gone before the gunners could even adjust their aim. As the B-25s closed in, pilots would unleash the fury of all 8 forward guns at a range of about 1,000 yards, walking the fire into the target ship. The relentless stream of 50 caliber bullets would sweep the decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft gunners, obliterating gun positions, shredding superstructures, and sowing absolute chaos. The objective was not to sink the ship with gunfire alone, although the damage could be substantial. The true purpose was to silence the ship's defenses and instill sheer terror in the crew. And then came the bombs. At a range of approximately 200 to 400 yards, flying at the minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb equipped with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour, strike the water, and skip across the surface. It would bounce once, maybe twice, and then slam into the side of the ship at or just below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb did not detonate on impact. Instead, it would penetrate the hull, sink slightly beneath the surface, and then explode. The detonation occurred in the most vulnerable part of the ship, below the armor belt where the hulls were thinnest. The blast was magnified by the incompressibility of water, which transmitted shock waves with devastating force. A single bomb exploding below the waterline could snap a ship's keel, rupture its fuel tanks, flood its engine rooms, and cause catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb detonated, the B-25 was already past the target, climbing rapidly to escape the blast and any secondary explosions. The entire attack, from the first gunshot to the bomb's release, took a mere 10 seconds. Skip bombing was not an entirely new concept. The British had experimented with the technique, and some American pilots had tried it independently. But the combination of skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's unique innovation. The strafer nose transformed the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before delivering the killing blow. This deadly combination would prove to be absolutely devastating. While Gunn was busy modifying aircraft, Allied intelligence was diligently monitoring Japanese naval movements. Ultra intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided detailed information about the enemy's plans. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known as FRUMEL, was reading Japanese messages almost in real time. In late February 1943, FRUMEL intercepted messages revealing that a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea. Its cargo consisted of troops and supplies for Japanese forces fighting against Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was remarkably specific. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would provide a protective escort. The convoy was scheduled to depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and arrive at Lae approximately 3 days later. This represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese forces would be significantly bolstered, potentially halting the Allied advance in its tracks. If the convoy failed, Japan would lose thousands of experienced troops and would likely never again attempt another major reinforcement by sea. General Kenny saw this as a golden opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactics against the most important target since Pearl Harbor. He gathered every available aircraft in the theater for a coordinated assault. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover, and the modified B-25 strafers executing their skip bombing attacks. It was set to be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Kenny personally briefed his squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were chillingly explicit. Find the convoy, attack without mercy, give no quarter, and sink every single ship. This was not a raid. This was to be an annihilation. At the stroke of midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy slipped out of Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy was comprised of 8 cargo transports: Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Aiyo Maru, Toa Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers formed the escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters were tasked with providing air cover during the voyage. This convoy was the most powerful force Japan had ever assembled for a resupply mission. Kimura fully expected to lose some ships. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses, but Japanese commanders were confident that enough ships would survive to deliver the crucial troops. They were tragically wrong. The convoy was sighted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on patrol. The crew immediately radioed its position, course, and composition. Kenny's command instantly launched reconnaissance aircraft to shadow the convoy. The weather initially favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms swept through the area, providing thick cloud cover and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft maintained contact but were unable to attack effectively through the raging storms. The convoy made good progress, moving at a steady 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour. This slow pace was dictated by the heavily laden transports. The destroyers could have easily reached 20 knots or more, but they were forced to match the convoy's crawl. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered about 90 miles. They were roughly halfway to Leh. The weather was worsening, a development that Kimura welcomed. Poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft. However, the storms also brought rough seas that relentlessly pounded the transports. The troops packed into the crowded holds below decks suffered terribly from seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the weather cleared slightly. Allied reconnaissance planes re-established visual contact. At approximately 10 kwas in the morning, 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet. The high-altitude bombing was, as expected, ineffective. The B-17s claimed hits, but Japanese records show only minimal damage. One transport may have been slightly damaged. The attack served one critical purpose. It forced the convoy to alter its course repeatedly, slowing its progress toward Leh. Throughout March 2, additional B-17 strikes continued. The Flying Fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes. The ships maneuvered frantically while Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-17s were damaged. 3 Japanese fighters were shot down, but not a single ship sank. The high-altitude attacks were harassing the convoy, not stopping it. As night fell on March 2, Kenny knew the decisive attack would come the following morning. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Larner had briefed his pilots again and again. They had rehearsed the attack profile on a wrecked ship on February 28, using combined formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and Beaufighters. Every pilot understood the mission. The skip bombing technique had been practiced. The strafer guns had been harmonized. The ordnance had been loaded. The point of no return was rapidly approaching. At dawn on March 3, 1943, the weather conditions were perfect for an air attack. Clear skies, excellent visibility, and calm seas. Rear Admiral Kimura must have felt a cold shiver of premonition. His convoy was approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough for land-based anti-aircraft guns to offer some support, but still dangerously vulnerable to air attack. The Allied strike force assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, the modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort. Multiple waves would attack from different directions throughout the day. The assault began at approximately 10 in the morning. The B-17s struck first from medium altitude, creating a diversion and forcing the ships to maneuver. Then, the low-altitude aircraft arrived. The Beaufighters screamed in first, their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns spitting fire, suppressing anti-aircraft positions. The destroyers unleashed everything they had, but the closing speed was simply too fast. And then, the modified B-25 strafers arrived, and the slaughter began. The modified B-25 strafers participated in multiple attack waves throughout the morning. One pilot selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his target and pushed the nose of his plane down to just 50 feet above the water. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns, a combined rate of fire of 6,800 rounds per minute, 180 pounds of projectiles per second, ripped into the transport. Tracers lit up the path of the bullets. The fire walked from the bow towards the superstructure, shredding everything in its path. Sailors were cut down where they stood. Anti-aircraft guns were blown apart. The bridge disintegrated under the relentless impacts. Metal fragments flew everywhere. Then he released his bombs. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses dropped away. They hit the water 200 yards from the ship, skipped once, and slammed into the hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled up and banked away. Behind him, the bombs detonated. 2 massive underwater explosions ripped the bottom out of the Kyokusei Maru. The transport lurched violently. Water poured into the engine room and holds. The ship began to settle immediately, listing heavily to port. It would sink within 15 minutes. Other modified B-25s followed in successive waves. Each selected a target. Each executed the same devastating attack profile. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships exploding. The transport Kembu Maru took multiple hits. At least 3 B-25s attacked it. The combined gunfire killed most of the crew above decks. 4 bombs struck below the waterline. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 10 minutes. The Teiyo Maru was strafed so heavily that fires erupted across its superstructure. 2 bombs tore open its hull. The transport went down with nearly 1,000 troops still trapped aboard. The Nojima tried to maneuver but was too slow. A B-25 strafer raked it from stern to bow, then put 2 bombs into its engine room. The ship lost power and began taking on water. It would sink later in the day. The bow fighters and remaining B-25s turned their attention to the destroyers. The destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was hit by strafing fire that killed almost everyone on the bridge, including Kimura, who was wounded. A bomb struck near the stern, starting a magazine fire. Secondary explosions blew the stern section clean off. The destroyer sank. The Tokatsukaze took direct bomb hits that ignited its fuel tanks. The destroyer became a floating inferno and sank within the hour. The Arashio collided with the transport Nojima while maneuvering and suffered heavy damage. The destroyer was abandoned and sank. Throughout the attack, Japanese Zero fighters tried desperately to protect the convoy, but the P-38 Lightnings engaged them at high altitude, while the B-25s operated at masthead height, where fighters could not safely attack without hitting their own ships. The coordination was flawless. The attack lasted for approximately 40 minutes. When the Allied aircraft withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 transports were sinking or had already sunk. 3 destroyers were gone. The remaining ships were scattered, some damaged, all in chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors were in the water. Bodies floated among the wreckage. Oil slicks burned on the surface of the sea. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes. The modified B-25s found the surviving ships limping towards Leh. The attacks were methodical and merciless. Each ship was targeted individually. The strafer B-25s came in low, guns blazing, bombs skipping. More transports sank. The destroyer Asashio, already damaged, took more bombs and went under. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning. Another 2,700 would be rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines sent from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops would eventually reach Leh, many without weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops who originally embarked, more than 5,700 were casualties. The convoy had been annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down. 3 P-38 fighters were lost in combat. 13 aircrew were killed. Compared to the Japanese losses, it was barely a skirmish. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it came to be known, represented a turning point in the Pacific War. It demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft could destroy a heavily escorted naval convoy. It proved the effectiveness of skip bombing when combined with overwhelming forward firepower. It validated every single modification Gunn had made to the B-25. Most importantly, it convinced Japan that resupplying its garrisons by sea in the Southwest Pacific was no longer feasible. Never again would Japan attempt a major convoy to New Guinea. The Japanese forces there would slowly starve and wither as their supplies dwindled. General MacArthur issued a communique claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and over 12,000 troops killed. The actual numbers were lower, but still devastating. The exaggerations were typical of wartime propaganda. What truly mattered was the strategic impact. Kenny had proven his concepts worked. Skip bombing was viable. Modified bombers were effective. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defenses. Paul Gunn, watching from Australia as the reports came in, must have felt a grim satisfaction. His modifications had destroyed a Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops. But his family was still in Santo Tomas, and the war was far from over. The resounding success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea led to the immediate expansion of the modification program. Kenny ordered all available B-25s in the theater to be converted to the Strafer configuration. Gunn worked even harder, training additional crews, refining techniques, and increasing production. By mid-1943, most B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American Aviation, the manufacturer, took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined his modifications, and requested detailed specifications. The company wanted to incorporate Gunn's innovations into its factory production. Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States to work with North American Aviation at their Inglewood and Kansas City plants. He spent several months in 1943 and early 1944 working with engineers to design factory-produced Strafer versions of the B-25. The result was the B-25G, which mounted a massive 75mm cannon in the nose along with 4 50-caliber machine guns. 405 B-25Gs were built. The 75mm cannon fired a 14.7-pound shell that could penetrate ship armor or destroy bunkers. But the cannon was difficult to load, required a crew member in the nose, and had a slow rate of fire. Gunn personally tested the B-25G in combat, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer. He hit the fire control system with the 75mm cannon, disabling the destroyer's ability to coordinate its guns. The ship was then sunk by conventional bombs. Gunn insisted publicly that he had sunk the destroyer with the cannon, but privately admitted it was the bombs that finished the job. The B-25H followed the G model into production. 1,000 B-25Hs were built, featuring the 75mm cannon and 14 50-caliber machine guns arranged in various positions. The H model relocated the dorsal turret forward and eliminated the co-pilot position to save weight, with the navigator handling the cannon loading. This massive firepower came at a cost. The B-25H was nose-heavy and difficult to control. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's Development Center, sent Gunn a message stating the modification was dangerous, and the aircraft should be grounded until the center of gravity issue was resolved. Legend has it that Gunn replied, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." The story may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captured Gunn's attitude. Technical perfection mattered less than combat effectiveness. The pilots learned to compensate for the handling issues. The final production variant, the B-25J, reverted to a conventional bombardier nose on some aircraft while retaining the Strafer nose on others. 4,318 B-25Js were built, making it the most numerous variant. Some B-25Js were equipped with 8 forward-firing guns in the nose, 4 guns in cheek blisters, 2 guns in the dorsal turret, and 4 guns in waist positions. The total armament could reach 18 50-caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. The firepower was unnecessary in most situations, but it intimidated enemy forces psychologically. Japanese troops learned to fear the sound of Mitchell engines. The distinctive roar meant death was incoming. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25s devastated Japanese targets across the Pacific. In August 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground, breaking the back of Japanese air power in the region. The Wewak raids were possible because Gunn had solved another problem: range. B-25s had sufficient range for most missions, but Wewak was at the very limit. Gunn developed a technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried in the bomb bay. Once the fuel was consumed, the tanks were jettisoned through an open hole in the floor. The system was crude, with fuel fumes permeating the fuselage and a constant breeze blowing through the aircraft, but it extended their range by several hundred miles. The Wewak raids ended Japanese air superiority over New Guinea and allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal air opposition. In November 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Rabaul Harbor in one of the war's most spectacular raids. Major Raymond "Jock" Hennebrey led 38 B-25s against shipping in the heavily defended harbor. The attack occurred at masthead height, with P-38s providing top cover and phosphorus bombs creating smoke screens. Of the 38 vessels in the harbor, 30 received direct hits. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transports and support ships were sunk or damaged. The raid paralyzed Rabaul as a forward base and demonstrated that even the strongest Japanese positions were vulnerable to the modified B-25s. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers provided close air support for ground forces, destroyed Japanese supply lines, and attacked shipping throughout the archipelago. The aircraft became known as the "Bat out of Hell" because their attacks came so fast and so low that defenders had no time to react. Gunn's modified B-25s were not the only weapons winning the Pacific War, but they were among the most effective. They destroyed hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. They enabled MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by isolating Japanese garrisons from resupply. They gave Allied forces an air superiority that made amphibious landings possible. Gunn's personal war continued throughout this period. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Letters occasionally reached him through the Red Cross, but communication was sporadic and censored. He knew that conditions in the camp were deteriorating. The Japanese guards became harsher as the war turned against them. Food became scarce. Disease spread. Gunn could do nothing except fight harder, hoping that each mission brought the war's end closer. In late 1944, American forces invaded Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at the age of 45, still looking for ways to destroy the enemy more efficiently. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn was on the ground when white phosphorus bombs exploded nearby. Fragments tore into his shoulder, causing massive damage. The wound was severe, rendering his right arm useless and causing excruciating pain. He was evacuated to Australia for treatment and would spend months in recovery. The wound ended Gunn's combat flying, but his war was almost over anyway. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, forming a flying column, liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The cavalry arrived just as the Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp's leadership. In the chaos of Manila's street fighting, American soldiers freed over 4,000 internees. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 14 days of internment. The family was emaciated, traumatized, but alive. General MacArthur personally visited the camp shortly after its liberation and met the Gunn family. He arranged for them to be flown to Australia to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The reunion occurred weeks after the liberation. The man who had left Manila on Christmas Eve 1941 finally held his family again. Polly had kept the children together through impossible circumstances. The boys, now young men, had survived the separation of male and female quarters. The girls had endured years of deprivation. They were together again, but they were different people than they had been. The war had changed them all. Gunn remained in the Army Air Forces after recovering from his wounds. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modifications and tactical development, though he no longer flew in combat. He retired from military service on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired due to his injuries. His decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, indicating a second award, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons. 9 Purple Hearts represented 9 separate occasions on which he was wounded or injured in combat. Gunn returned to the Philippines and re-established Philippine Airlines. The country was rebuilding from years of occupation and the destruction of liberation. Gunn helped restore air transportation, reconnecting islands that had been isolated. He was still flying, still taking risks, still pushing the limits. On October 11, 1957, 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was flying a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a severe storm. The plane crashed. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died doing what he had done for nearly 40 years, flying. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where he had once been an instructor. His legacy lived on in multiple forms. The B-25 Strafer modifications he pioneered remained standard throughout the war. Approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchells were built, and thousands were configured as strafers based on Gunn's designs. The skip bombing technique he helped perfect destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships and contributed significantly to the Allied victory in the Pacific. Gunn demonstrated that innovation could come from anywhere, even from the modifications made by a grieving father in a maintenance hangar. The official military bureaucracy wanted to fight World War II with existing weapons and approved tactics. Gunn showed that desperate circumstances required desperate innovations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a case study in military academies worldwide. The combination of intelligence, coordination, new weapons, and new tactics achieved a complete victory at minimal cost. It demonstrated what air power could accomplish against naval forces when properly employed. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 casualties, all for the loss of 4 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were simple and brutal. You could not survive in an environment where the enemy controlled the air. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of missions that would never be flown, hundreds of troops who would never fight, and thousands of rounds of ammunition that would never be fired. Destroying supplies before they reached the battlefield was the most efficient form of warfare. The modified B-25 became the weapon system that made this possible. It could range hundreds of miles to find ships, suppress their defenses with overwhelming firepower, destroy them with skip bombing attacks, and return to base for another mission. One B-25 Strafer could accomplish what had previously required coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft types. Japan learned this lesson too late. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese commanders knew they could no longer move large convoys in daylight within range of Allied air bases. They switched to nighttime movements, used submarines for critical supplies, and increasingly relied on barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters during the day. These measures reduced but did not eliminate their losses. B-25 Strafers hunted barges with the same efficiency they hunted ships. Night-flying B-25s equipped with radar found convoys in the darkness. There was no safe time, no safe method, and no safe place for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. The stranglehold tightened month by month until the Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated. In New Guinea, in the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific Islands, Japanese troops fought on with dwindling supplies and no hope of reinforcement. They were brave, tenacious, and doomed. Air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25 made their courage irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific. The aircraft evolved with the B-25G, H, and J variants incorporating increasingly heavy armament, but the basic concept remained Gunn's original innovation. A medium bomber converted into a flying gun platform that could suppress defenses and deliver devastating attacks at minimum altitude. When the war ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still flying combat missions. They were among the aircraft that escorted the Japanese surrender delegation from Japan to Manila in mid-August. It was fitting that the aircraft that had done so much to defeat Japan would witness its surrender. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese historians confirmed the significance of Gunn's innovations. Japanese naval officers stated that after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they knew they could not safely operate in waters within range of Allied air bases. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Convoy commanders knew that low-flying bombers could appear without warning and destroy entire formations before their defenses could respond. The modified B-25s had created a new type of warfare where medium bombers hunted ships with the efficiency of submarines and the firepower of cruisers. The implications extended far beyond the Pacific War. Post-war air forces worldwide studied the lessons of skip bombing and forward-firing armament. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed primarily for gun attack rather than bombing, became standard in many air forces. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships used in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts were conceptual descendants of Gunn's